The views expressed on Skeptically Speaking are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
Bring it on! The skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is. Cause we're skeptically speaking.
Hello and welcome to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Shell. My guest today is Rob Brooks, Professor of Evolution and Director of the Evolution and Ecology Research Centre at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. He's an award-winning scientist who studies sex and its consequences in animals and humans, and he's just been listed as a finalist for the Australian Museum Eureka Prize for Science Communication. He is the author of Sex, Genes, and Rock and Roll: How Evolution Has Shaped the Modern World. Welcome, Rob.
Thanks very much for having me, Desiree.
Now, what you've done in your book is to take a variety of topics that we routinely think of as being shaped by cultural influences, and you look at them through an evolutionary lens. There are sections on obesity, population size, infanticide, polygamy, gender inequality, and the aforementioned rock and roll. Now, those are some substantial and potentially dangerous topics, sir. So why those subjects in particular?
Well, I think those are the kinds of subjects that really compel people. I mean, if you pick up what I consider to be the primary literature, which is the gossip magazines and the glossy magazines and stuff, you see those are the things that people are concerned about. Parenting and how to be a good parent and how to be a good lover and how to recognize and not go crazy when your love is unrequited and all of those kinds of things. And so I thought, why not talk about the stuff that people are most interested in their day-to-day lives?
Well, so when you talk about these topics as being affected by evolution, isn't that potentially going to be seen as just a short jump away from biological determinism?
That's a really good question. I think one of my main agendas as a science communicator, but in this book in particular, is to get past this idea that everything can be sifted into either biological or cultural, either genetic or environmental, because the ways in which our biology shapes our behavior is through our brains and through our experience. Our experience shapes our brains. It changes the physical connections between neurons in our brains, and similarly, our biology shapes our experience. For instance, our genes influence the way in which we take on learning, the way in which we, what kinds of concepts, what kinds of lessons are more easily adopted. And so it really is, it goes way back to the ancient Greeks. It's the cornerstone of the way that we think about the world, this idea that, you've got these fixed innate qualities and these highly plastic variable qualities, and everything is either one or the other. And, my agenda, it might seem a little more beige, but my agenda is really to demonstrate that everything is an interaction between genes and environment and between evolution and culture. And so instead of saying, that's strictly cultural, I say there's nothing that's entirely cultural and there's nothing that's entirely genetic. Let's see how things really do emerge through these complicated interactions.
Well, are the camps really that extreme, biological determinists and social constructionists? Is it controversial to think that most human behaviors and actions have a little of both? Because that doesn't seem controversial.
No, I think it's a very reasonable middle position, but the way that we often present stories, for instance, if you're presenting a science story in the news media, it will often, you'll often want to go towards backing one of those two horses in a two-horse race because it makes for more compelling reading. It creates a sort of narrative tension.
Right.
And so the folks who don't read a lot of biology, who might pick up an evolution book, once or twice in their lifetime, or, a sociology book for that matter, once or twice in their lifetime, are the folks who are most likely to think that things can be either all genetic or all cultural. But even, among my colleagues in evolutionary biology, you'll see folks going, oh, no, we won't deal with that because that's entirely cultural. And so, even the people who understand that everything is an interaction between genotype and environment are still inclined occasionally to throw one out and keep the other in understanding a particular phenomenon. So, it's not groundbreaking. I'm not the first person to say this, but what I'm trying to do is to show people how it works.
So then do you think that every topic could potentially have an evolutionary angle?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there were potentially be, or there certainly are, a number of topics where evolution might not have anything interesting or new to say, might not add terribly much. But, given that we're biological creatures and everything we do has some biology to it, and given that evolution shapes our biology, I'd say evolution certainly affects everything, but it's not the only thing. One of the other things I explore in the book is the interactions between evolution and economics. And, in terms of the bottom-up forces, in the case of economics, the market forces of individual actors, selling things to each other and buying things from one another, those kinds of factors that add up to create this aggregate overall thing we call the economy are very similar to individual actions influencing the success of genes, influencing this overall thing that we call evolution by natural selection. And evolution by natural selection and economics interact with one another in really cool ways.
Well, now here's where it gets a bit more problematic. What's the difference between a Just So story and what you're doing in this book?
So Just So stories they come from Rudyard Kipling's book, The Just So Stories, I believe. And the most famous of those is the story of the elephant's child, where the elephants used to have short proboscises, short noses, and the elephant's child was very curious and wanted to know what the crocodile has for dinner or whatever. And he went along the great grey green greasy Limpopo River and met the crocodile and asked him, and the crocodile said, "Come closer," and bit him on the nose eventually. And the elephant's child pulled, and the crocodile pulled, and the elephant's child pulled, and eventually the elephant's child's nose stretched. And then he went back, and all the other elephants were jealous and went through a similar kind of process of getting long trunks themselves. And it's truly a nonsense story. It's a children's bedtime story. And in the 70s, when there was, this business of the place of evolution in understanding modern society really reached fever pitch with E.O. Wilson's book Sociobiology and Wilson's Harvard colleagues Stephen Jay Gould and Dick Lewontin, pretty much throwing out the study of evolution for understanding human behavior, even though they were evolutionary biologists themselves. At that point, Gould, who was master of rhetoric, said, all sociobiology is just so storytelling. You're simply telling stories. You're simply saying it could have evolved this way and outlining a scenario. And, there's no more evidence for that than for anything else. Unless you have a time machine, you can't test it. It's unfalsifiable, etc., etc. Now, that's not strictly true because Gould should have known and did know that all sorts of evolutionary evidence. In evolutionary biology, we don't have time machines, but we can go back and we can look at the past, or we can look at current function, and we do it in animal behavior. Gould had no problem with that. But this epithet of being just so stories has really stuck. However, there's a wonderful paper by a guy called David Queller, and Queller is one of the preeminent evolutionary biologists of the current day, and he deconstructs this paper in which Gould did this, called what was then called sociobiology, just so storytelling, and basically says, yes, there are just so stories in sociobiology, there are just so stories in evolution, but we know them by a kind of name, and that kind of name is hypotheses. We can come up with hypotheses, we can come up with stories, but the really important thing is, as scientists, we have to go out and test them. And we test them against the evidence we can gather, and sometimes they hold up, and sometimes they don't. And as long as they hold up, they are good theories, and for as long as they hold up. And that's the basic process of scientific investigation. So you'll often see folks, particularly people who are uncomfortable with what might be the political implications of a particular just so story or a particular piece of evidence. You'll see them saying, well, it's just so storytelling. And it may have begun with a just so story, but it certainly ends with evidence and with testing, if it's good science.
Are the ideas in your book backed up by consensus science, or are some of these more like thought experiments?
There's a mixture, and I say that in the introduction. I talk about reclaiming the just so story. I loved the just so stories as a child. So some of what I talk about is what you would probably call consensus science. Some of it is more breaking science. Some of my ideas, for instance, about protein and obesity, I would say are not a majority position, but they happen to be positions that I think are on the ascent. And then occasionally there are ideas that I talk about that are, what if it was this way? And how about that as an explanation? And they're kind of the seed for people to go forth. And I hope some scientists are going to pick up on some of these ideas and go and gather evidence. I did this actually a number of times in the book when I got to a point and I thought, well, here's an interesting thought, but there's no data on that. Let's go and have a look if there's any sort of low-hanging fruit in the data sets. And a couple of times I got serious scientific papers out of this process of writing for the popular audience.
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking. I'm talking with Rob Brooks, the author of Sex, Genes, and Rock and Roll: How Evolution Has Shaped the Modern World. Okay, so let's see how this works with one of the book topics. You mentioned obesity, the obesity crisis, actually, in the book. Now, this is a real thing, not just media-generated hyperbole?
Oh, absolutely. We're reaching the point, if we haven't reached it already, in which more people are chronically overnourished and, have a body mass index of over 30, which is the sort of clinical cutoff for obesity, than are hungry, than are starving and are malnourished. Now, if you think about the developing world and the large number of people who just do not get enough to eat, the fact that there are an equal number of those people largely in the developed world, although some in the developing world, in which, who are getting too much to eat and who have put on too much body weight, you understand the crisis, I think. And it's not just an epidemic of sort of wealthy, industrialized nations. Here in Australia, people like to think that obesity is something that America invented. Not true. The 6 most obese nations in the world are all Pacific Island nations. And in places like Nauru, they've gone from a very lean population with very realistic body mass indices to, within 2 generations, 80% of the adults are obese.
Now, the reasons that we hear for that in the news and such are that we have horrible willpower, or that unhealthy food costs less than healthy food, which is, both are undoubtedly true, but you say that there's a deeper evolutionary connection.
Absolutely. There are a number of interacting deeper evolutionary connections. So the first point I would make is that for all of human history, until 200 years ago at the earliest, there was a much, much greater risk of starving to death and of running out of fuel to run your body than of becoming obese and suffering from, metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes and all of those nasty consequences of obesity. And so our bodies have evolved much better defense mechanisms against starvation than they have against obesity. In fact, our defense mechanisms against obesity are very weak because it's not a problem we've faced in the past. And that's one of the important lessons about evolution is, of course, we're adapted to the environment that our ancestors lived in, because our ancestors were the ones who did best in those environments and who passed those genes for doing well in those environments on to us. So a couple of important episodes in human evolutionary history. 5 million years ago, our ancestors, every one of us, descends from individuals. They were not yet people in any sense, but individuals that were vegetarian apes. They spent most of the day foraging. They ate mostly, leaves and berries and fruits. Every now and again, they would eat meat if they could get it, or insects, just more or less like if you watched a documentary on chimps. You can imagine that's probably similar to what our diet was. By 2 million years ago, our ancestors were hunting and gathering on the African savanna. And the important thing is it's not just hunting, it's also gathering. So hunting brings in lots of animal protein and animal fat, although most of the animals were lean. The gathering part involves very high fiber, we would call them high GI now, vegetables, roots and fruits and things that were, more or less difficult to digest and difficult to get the carbohydrates and the proteins out of. And we stayed that way until 12,000 years ago. So, for 99% of our time being human, we have been hunters and gatherers, in which, you basically had to struggle to get enough food, but that food had a good protein content. Then with each time that agriculture arose, and we know it arose 5 or 6 times at least independently, each time there was this domestication of at least one cereal crop, whether it was corn in Mesoamerica or whether it was wheat in Levant or rice in China. And with that, there was suddenly enough food to support a lot more individuals, but it was harder to get enough protein. So suddenly protein became relatively more expensive, but carbohydrates became cheaper. And then for somewhere between 12,000 years and maybe just a few hundred years, or even just a generation in the case of some people, our ancestors were subsistence farmers trying to bring through these crops, got enough carbohydrate, struggled to get enough protein, almost always a lean season just before the harvest in which it was, food was pretty scarce and we had to defend against hunger. And then suddenly, with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, you have carbohydrates becoming mechanized. The first mechanized industry wasn't the cotton mills of England, but it was the sugarcane factories of the West Indies, powered by slave labor and by the first steam machines. And suddenly you have sugar becoming available for the first time in history on a large scale, other carbohydrates that you can transport easily, you can store easily, and then with the 20th century you can refrigerate and snap freeze. So suddenly we're in this carbohydrate delivery economy. Carbs have become, throughout human history, progressively cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Protein has become relatively dearer and dearer and dearer. And so while we're adapted, very long-winded answer, but while we're adapted to avoiding starvation, we're also adapted to a diet that was higher in protein and in which carbs weren't as cheap as they are now. And those two ingredients together probably explain a great deal of the obesity crisis.
Well, actually, can you just briefly mention the protein leverage hypothesis? Because I hadn't heard that, but it's very interesting.
So the protein leverage hypothesis is an idea from Stephen Simpson and David Robenheimer. Simpson's my colleague over at the University of Sydney, which is a couple of miles from where I'm sitting right now. And they're actually entomologists. They work on insects and insect diets and locusts, but they've developed a method called the geometric framework, which is sort of revolutionizing the way that we understand how various nutrients combine to create obesity or aging or mortality rates, etc., etc. And what they've demonstrated is that people need about 14% of their diet to come from protein. And if you don't get 14% of the calories in your diet do not come from protein, then you have to eat a little bit more in order to compensate for the fact that you're not getting enough protein. Carbohydrates and fats, we can lay them down in our body and we can store them, but we can't store protein, and our bodies need protein to do a number of important functions. Repair muscles, repair neurons, etc., etc. So if we're not getting our 14% protein, then we overeat until we reach that protein target. And if you don't reach your protein target, for every kilojoule, or in your case, calorie of protein that you don't eat, you need to eat an extra 58 calories of carbohydrates and fats just to sort of shut your body up, to tell your body, look, stop now, I've had enough to eat. Whereas if you overeat protein, you only undereat about 11 calories of carbohydrates and fat. So there's this huge asymmetry in how we compensate for the excess protein or the shortfall in protein. And so what Simpson and Robenheimer have done is that they've basically shown that since the 1960s, the sort of average diet in countries like the USA, where there is a noticeable obesity crisis, the average diet has drifted from about 14% protein just down to 12%. It doesn't sound like a lot, 2%. But for every calorie that you're not eating in protein, you're eating 58 extra calories in carbohydrates and fat. And that can more or less account for the rise in average body mass index over that time.
It's vaguely frightening, sir.
Yes, it is. It is, because it's very difficult to do anything about it.
Joy, you're listening to Skeptically Speaking, and we'll be right back with more of Rob Brooks, author of Sex, Genes, and Rock and Roll, How Evolution Has Shaped the Modern World, after this.
Skeptically Speaking wants you to question everything. To be a part of the discussion, call and record your question on our listener question line at Speak 73101. That's 773-257-3101. Long-distance charges may apply. Sunday nights at 6 Mountain Time, join our Ustream chat room to listen and ask questions as we record interviews live. Just click the Listen Online button at skepticallyspeaking.com. You can also email your questions and comments to live@skepticallyspeaking.com, or if you're on Twitter, tweet us at Skeptical Radio. To find out where Skeptically Speaking airs near you, to listen to past episodes, or download the weekly podcast, check out our website at skepticallyspeaking.com. While you're there, follow the links to connect with us on our Facebook page, our Twitter feed, or to subscribe to the show in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Schell. My guest is Rob Brooks, Professor of Evolution and Director of the Evolution and Ecology Research Centre at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. He's the author of Sex, Genes, and Rock and Roll. Now, a topic that we've heard a lot about recently, very much about, is population. You just mentioned the transitions of the human diet, and there's actually a link between changing birth rates and that transition, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. With the advent of agriculture, we find that the carrying capacity of the landscape goes up by about tenfold. So suddenly, where an area of land could support 1,000 hunter-gatherers, it could suddenly support 10,000 agriculturalists, which probably explains a lot about the replacement of hunting and gathering by agriculture. Agriculturalists, of course, succeed. They breed at a far higher rate than hunters and gatherers, and then they need more land to work, and so they will work outwards, and they slowly displace the hunters and gatherers, often involving armed conflict, because hunters and gatherers don't want to be displaced, and yet there are superior numbers for the farmers, and so you have this spread. And in fact, if you watch the European Y chromosome carried by most male Europeans seems to have come from the Middle East and the Levant area, where the first wheat-based agriculture was, and so we think that it's largely about male lines spreading out through Europe as a consequence of the success of farming. Then, with every successive improvement in agriculture, the number of people that an area of land can support goes up and up and up until such point as the land becomes degraded. And so back in the late 1700s, Thomas Robert Malthus basically said, well, population can't grow infinitely, because sooner or later the populations will grow much larger than the lands have means to support them. And Malthus has been sort of poo-pooed by many economists who say, actually, you're not accounting for human ingenuity. We always find a new way to avoid things. There was talk of Malthusian gloom soon after the Second World War, where countries like Mexico and India and China were said to be outbreeding the means of the land to support them, and yet the Green Revolution delivered this, quantum increase in the in the yields that crops produced, and as a consequence, we've largely avoided that Malthusian crash. But the other side of Malthus is that that's exactly how that was the inspiration for Darwin's theory of natural selection, in which he recognized that as animals increase and as they succeed, suddenly they exceed the ability of the land to support them, and so that competition is the force that sort of sorts out the winners from the losers. It's only the individuals that are best able to compete who are able to have babies and pass on their genes, and so the animal becomes better and better adapted to that kind of competition. And so, there's this tight link between the ecology of food production and the economics of food production and population size, and then onto natural selection.
Then at certain points it was advantageous to have many children because it meant more workers. But then there's kind of a confluence of events happens, and then having more children becomes a burden?
Well, that's right. So subsistence agriculturalists, when you're working the ground, many hands make light work, or should we say many hands are able to work a larger area of land. And so as long as there is land to expand into, it's really good to have as many children as possible, because those children, they're hard work for a couple of years, and then perhaps there's a grandmother or a grandfather or an aunt who can look after them for that period. But then they start being able to look after the livestock. And if you walk, if you drive around Africa, you'll still see young boys out of school looking after the family goats or cattle. Then they're able to, carry water and get firewood and then start working the ground. And so, with subsistence agriculture, the larger the family, the sort of greater the economies of scale, the better the family is able to do, the more they're able to reproduce, and the more they're able to expand. And so you've got this ongoing kind of virtuous cycle. Problem comes when the land is saturated with farmers. And so imagine Europe around about the time of the Industrial Revolution, really most of the land that could be worked had been worked. And so you have a small number of land-owning gentry and a large number of labourers and peasants basically working on the land, in the Middle Ages certainly, but nowhere to expand into. Now the families that are doing the best from this work, the families that are best able to, are fed the best and could turn those resources into babies, they risk a very severe poverty trap if they produce too many children, because either you have to split the land up or you have to have some kind of primogeniture or some other kind of rule for only passing the land on to one or a very few children. And suddenly there's no longer an economic / evolutionary incentive to produce a lot of babies, and at that time there's a lot of incentive for innovation, for getting more out of the land, for doing better from the work that you have people doing. And as a consequence of that, you need to invest more in each individual child, and the more you have to invest in each individual child, parents have only got 24 hours in the day, and so they need to have fewer children. And so, the more the economy becomes a knowledge economy and an education economy, etc., and the more people aspire to social mobility in that kind of an economy, the fewer children they're likely to have. And so we have a slowing down of the birth rate with the Industrial Revolution. And that's, some people say that's contraception, but in the US and the UK, it happened 200 years before we had really reliable, good contraception.
Well, now the other choice, of course, is for your country to mandate that you have less children. If you're looking at places like China formally, or India more informally but still fairly formal, is that going against evolution? Or is it actually pushing it along in the direction that we would like it to go?
That's a really interesting question. I tend not to think about evolution as having a direction.
Right.
Certainly no design, although
right.
you can intend to push it in a particular direction. But what you find when there's an attempt to sort of direct evolution from the top down is that it almost always creates the most perverse outcomes. So the example with China is a very, very good example. China, back in the 70s, recognized that they had a huge population issue, that the land would probably not be able to support them, and so they instituted a one-child policy. Now, that one-child policy, it's important to remember, we tend to think in all of China you can only have one child. It doesn't really apply evenly. In the cities and the very dense cities of the eastern seaboard of China and Beijing and those kinds of places, you really can, a couple is only allowed to have one child, and it's the sort of draconian policy that many of us think about when we think about the one-child policy. Then, in southeastern China, in the very good agricultural lands, very high population densities, there is a slightly more relaxed form of the one-child policy. And that relaxed form allows a family who has had one daughter, where the first child is a daughter, to have a second child. And what this recognizes is it's actually the government recognizing the crucial importance of sons in Han Chinese culture. And that sons are, very heavily wished for. And then the third form of the one-child policy is out west, and particularly among the ethnic minorities that tend to live out in Western China, in which you can pretty much have as many children as you want to have. Obviously China is such a huge country. It's incredibly ecologically diverse in terms of the ecologies that human beings face. So the out west, you tend to find that there aren't particularly perverse outcomes of the one-child policy, because there isn't much of a one-child policy. Right. In Beijing and the cities where you have only, you can only have one child, well, really, there's not terribly much wiggle room, although what we find is that the sex ratio of those children is somewhat biased towards males. So families are somewhat more likely to have a boy in those places where they're only allowed to have one child than have a girl. And I'll get onto the way they're doing that in a moment. But in the area where you can have a second child if the first one is a girl, families do not leave the sex of the second child up to chance. And, where a normal sex ratio at birth is about 107 boys for every 100 girls, what we could find is that there are some areas where there's as high as 150 or 160 boys for every 100 girls. And what's happening, because the Chinese government, with their one-child policy, has basically given people the tools to control their fertility by, making contraception very easily available, but also making abortion trivially easy to get. Mm-hmm. And with the spread of ultrasound that could tell at a reasonably early stage the sex of a child, you suddenly have essentially state-sponsored female feticide. It's not even infanticide. So, in China, historically, there has been female infanticide and neglect of daughters, and all of these things have contributed to a very male-biased sex ratio in China. And suddenly in the last 20, 30 years, it's got much, much worse because the technology has made it much easier to terminate a pregnancy before it even gets, too late into the second trimester, as a consequence of a top-down attempt to control population growth, combined with a very strong cultural bias towards having sons.
You're tuned in to Skeptically Speaking. Today we're talking to the author of Sex, Genes, and Rock and Roll, How Evolution Has Shaped the Modern World, Rob Brooks. Now, all this talk about birth, there's something that I've been wondering about. With more women making the decision not to have children and more women than ever before working outside the home, it's not really as evolutionarily advantageous for a man to be trying to find the best womb for his progeny. And that's what we hear is the goal here. It may be a better economic strategy actually to find a woman who would be a good wage earner now to both provide for the children, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. And I think that's an interesting observation, and I think something that evolutionary psychology sometimes loses sight of. Remember, we're dealing with different types of incentives. We have these deep-seated evolutionary incentives to find, in the case of men, to find a woman who is going to be fertile and is going to be a bearer of good, healthy children. That's not the easiest thing to get around because it's evolved over many, many thousands of generations. Right. And so, we're still very cued into those cues of beauty that tell us about youth and fertility and likely fertility, etc., etc. But on top of that, we also are economic optimizers. And, absolutely, the family as an economic unit, it pays for mum and dad to have some kind of optimal economic strategy. And evolution isn't blind to that. Certainly, we're good at picking out good providers. Women are famously good at picking out good providers in men. But I think that men are also good at finding economically good providers in women as well. I don't think that the economy has, it's tempting to think of the economy of some sort of 1940s golden period or 1950s period that the conservatives like to hark back to as being some kind of archetype. But of course, that was a particularly, that was a historical anomaly of its own. There are times throughout history in which women have been very much providers for their family, and for most of history, in fact, most of the food that the family eats has come from mum. Most of the work has been done by mum, and what the contributions by dad are more erratic and unpredictable and often more specialized, if there is a dad at all. And so, we're very good as a species at dealing with the circumstances and the opportunities that get thrown up by who comes along and by what's happening and by what's allowed in the culture. And so we shouldn't get too bogged down in the idea of, the man being the provider and the woman being the mum or something like that, because I think that that's a very staid and certainly a very wrong way of looking at history.
Well, then how often Are evolutionary drives in direct conflict with our economic ones?
It's a good question. I don't know that I could answer that off the top of my head.
It seems like maybe that's a thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, let me divert you to a different type of conflict quickly, which I think answers some of the previous question, and that is the conflict of interest between the mum and the dad, even in a family where mummy and daddy love each other very much, and etc. Mums and dad, or men and women, mates, often have quite different evolutionary interests. And we find that in the parts of the developing world where people still live by subsistence agriculture, and so in a way similar to the way most people's ancestors were, nearly everybody's ancestors were 300 years ago, a lot of the, women are still having 7, 8, 9 children. In fact, the average in a place like, rural Ghana is 7 children. So there are women having 10, 12 children in their lifetime. And by far the majority of pregnancies are unwanted pregnancies, where men don't want the woman to, use contraception. They don't want her to have access to abortion, and women do. And they very much want to be able to control their own reproduction and space the children out a little bit better and invest more in each of those individual children. So that's exactly the point. As those countries start to industrialize it, which it starts to become worthwhile investing more in each individual child. But because men can, if the woman dies in childbirth, or if she has so many children that she lives a short-ish life, from a sort of cold evolutionary point of view, the man doesn't lose nearly as much as she loses. She loses everything. He loses a mate, possibly somebody he loves, but he can always have babies with somebody else, and, late into old age. And as a consequence, what's best for the goose is not always best for the gander. And so underlying that change to a lower fertility, that is an important part of improving, outcomes for children, and certainly improving outcomes for women, is a tension between the evolutionary interests of the man and the evolutionary interests of the woman. And one of the things that turns that around is when the economic interests of the man start to come into conflict with his evolutionary interests. Doing what's good for the mum and for the kids starts to become in his economic interests, and he then is able to temper his evolutionary desire for his wife to bear him as many children as possible. And so that's a kind of an indirect answer to your question, I suppose.
No, that was great. But we have a question from the chat from Kylie.
How problematic are misinterpretations of evolutionary biology, like Kruger's idea that women evolved to shop? Do these kinds of claims make it difficult for the field to be taken seriously?
That's a great question. I meet people all the time who have difficulty taking evolution, what's now called evolutionary psychology. In the 70s, the sort of similar movement was called social biology, and they have real difficulty taking it seriously, partly because it's possible to come up with, explanations. Now, I don't know Kruger's shopping theory, but it does sound like, it's probably got an element of something that might be true in it, as well as a whole lot of stereotypes and what we'd like to believe to be true, and a whole lot of newsworthiness on top of it. And what the blend is a little hard to say. I find it difficult, though, that evolutionary explanations have a particular difficulty with it. I think that a lot of, if you were to go into sociology or into economics, certainly in gender studies, there is some stuff in there that, they're ideas and they're worth talking about and they're worth considering. And sometimes they're equally wacky, and yet at the same time, the same, I don't know that people have as much trouble taking them seriously as, that they don't seem to, it doesn't seem to be the same obstacle for those fields. Maybe it is. I'm not in those fields, so maybe they all feel like, oh, gosh, we're not taking seriously because so-and-so over there is always sprouting forth these wacky ideas. I don't know. But, the thing with all information is there's good stuff and there's bad stuff, and you have to be able to sift the good stuff from the bad stuff. As you would know, that's what you, I guess, spend each week doing on your show. It's the process of process of sifting information. And in evolutionary psychology, there's some brilliant stuff out there, and there's also some absolute bunkum.
And how does one tell the difference, especially lay people?
Yeah, I think it's really hard. I think it's quite difficult to tell because you're not practiced at reading the studies and don't have the time to read the studies and to understand them. But our Prime Minister, who's had a very rough ride during this term of office, she's heading a minority government, and at some point she was addressing the media, and they said, "Well, what's the solution?" And she said, "Well, don't write rubbish." And I suppose evolutionary psychologists should take some responsibility for not writing garbage. And I'm not saying that study that your listener is referring to is garbage, because I haven't read it myself and I won't judge it until I've done that. But, there is definitely some garbage out there, and that each piece of garbage diminishes the field, as it does in any field of science and in any field of understanding.
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking, and I'm talking about how evolution shaped the modern world with Rob Brooks, author of Sex, Genes, and Rock and Roll. And we'll be right back after these messages.
On the next episode of Skeptically Speaking, it's part 2 of our 2-week focus on evolution and genetics. Science writer Sam Kean, author of the New York Times bestseller The Disappearing Spoon, returns to the show to talk about his new book, The Violinist's Thumb, and other lost tales of love, war, and genius as written by our genetic code. That's next week on Skeptically Speaking, on your local radio station, or online at skepticallyspeaking.com.
Welcome back to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Schell. I'm joined by Rob Brooks, professor of evolution and director of the Evolution and Ecology Research Centre at the University of New South Wales, and the author of Sex, Genes, and Rock and Roll. So let's talk about that last bit, rock and roll. Now, I thought that it was commonly understood that music is a cultural behavior, not biological. Like, at most, it could be used to attract mates as a sexual display, and I'm sure we've all heard that. But that was more of a bonus than something that was selected for. But you think it's more than that?
Oh, absolutely. So, one of the reasons I've chosen rock and roll is that it quite clearly, there's no gene for rock and roll. It's not something that arose due to natural selection the way that we often think about natural selection, because it arose in the 1950s. And the cultural circumstances and the economic circumstances that gave rise to it are, really well understood and discussed ad nauseum and ad infinitum. But what I wanted to show was there's no such thing as an exclusively cultural phenomenon. And so what I took was this thing that is the quintessence of culture, rock and roll music, and said, well, now let's try and understand what role evolution played. I'm not saying this is all about evolution. This is about the interaction between our evolved genes and therefore our evolved minds and bodies and changing economic and cultural circumstances. And so I spend quite a bit of time talking about those economic circumstances, like the fact that until about 1900, when the phonograph was invented, and then later the radio and the television, etc., music had to basically appeal to the whole family, because the whole family would go out of an evening and listen to a band playing the popular hits of the day. And so bands, musicians had to be versatile, they had to be good at playing other people's music from sheet music, and the music had to appeal to everyone. Now, sometimes that gave rise to sublime music, and sometimes I think it was a bit like the Eurovision Song Contest. In trying to please everybody, it just gets a bit beige and trivial. Now, with the invention of the phonograph, you have the ability to target music to particular demographics. And so suddenly you have jazz appealing to the young people in the 1920s. And similarly, rock and roll was a phenomenon that came about because of the selling of 7-inch singles, but also radio and television and jukeboxes. Suddenly the music could be tailored to young people. Now, what happened then was that young men, ambitious young men, usually angry working class guys, were able to very quickly learn a reasonably simple set of instruments and leverage that to suit their evolved agendas, the agendas that all young men share, but that are particularly brought up by the economic circumstances of being working class and aspiring to something bigger. That doesn't have to start with an aspiration to world domination, but it sort of builds, in the case of Elvis, to that. And it's only possible for a guy like Elvis to be heard around the world and to sell records all the way around the world. And so I try to pick out some of the biological elements that contributed to the rock and roll phenomenon.
Why rock and roll specifically, though? Because you very much make a distinction between rock and other types of music, that rock and roll is more tied to evolution, because I think all of that makes sense in terms of all music, a lot of what you're speaking of. But why rock and roll? Why do you focus on that?
Well, you were exactly right that all music, derives this common power from our biological and our evolved past. The reason that music can move us so much, the reason that it can stir our hearts, is because we have evolved preferences for certain, to hear certain types of things made by other people, and to interpret them in certain ways. So I'm not being very articulate here, but just the same way that a very beautiful face or a very beautiful body stirs feelings in us, so a very beautiful piece of music, or a piece of music whose chief aim is some form of seduction, I guess, also stirs us, because we have evolved the capacity to be tuned into that piece of music. Okay, not necessarily that piece of music, but to be tuned into original, melodious, harmonious, rhythmic compositions that show that the person behind it, the individual behind it, has put some real thought into it and has tried to connect and has connected with us personally. Now, that's true of all music. What I wanted to do, though, was to show that one particular phenomenon had a little more to it than simply just being a good musician. And the reason is I thought that there's a very interesting statistic, and that is that in the 1950s, just before rock and roll really hit, about 1/3 of the singers of songs in the top records in the United States of America were women. So women were doing, not as many women as men in the charts, but they were definitely a significant number of the musicians. Suddenly with rock and roll, you have this drop down to something like 2% in the 1960s. 2% of the singers of hit songs on what was by then the Billboard Hot 100 were women. And that slowly crept up to the point now where in the last decade, from 2000 to 2009, it was essentially back to the 1950s levels. All right, but in rock and roll, it was still, the songs that were considered rock and roll, it was still only about 12% of the singers were women. Whereas in disco and electronica and dance, women were producing 50% of the music, not just as singers, but as musicians as well. And so what I think that analysis demonstrates is very clearly, it demonstrates that there's no sense to the idea that men make better music than women. They don't. Women are as good at making music as men. I think the evidence is very clear all the way through from primary school to the top of the Billboard Hot 100. But in the genre of rock and roll, it somehow seems to be very male-dominated. And if you read some of the feminist literature on rock and roll, that'll be because rock and roll is misogynistic. But I think that that's not quite enough of an answer. And the reason that it's not enough of an answer is that the audience for rock and roll music is 50-50 men and women. And so it's, the creators of media, the producers of music, the bands, they deliver to people what works. And what works is what, works for a crowd of men and women. The Beatles were all men, the Rolling Stones were all men, but the people who were screaming at the airports for them were all women. And the reason I think that rock and roll was suddenly so successful in those economic circumstances of the late 50s and early 60s is that suddenly a bunch of particularly men figured out that this particular type of music was a very good way of attracting women and of stimulating women. And of course, a lot of men recognized that they would have to play that music on their gramophones and on their own guitars if they were, just playing music at home, and on their iPods and the mixtapes that they make for people. And so suddenly, for a short period of time, men got on that rock and roll bus quicker than women. Now, I want to be really cautious here about not trying to make a sexist, an argument that substantiates sexism, because this is not about men making better music than women. I think it's just about opportunism on the part of some men suddenly creating this thing. And, a lot of people say rock and roll is dead, and in a way, it's just another type of music now. It doesn't have that ascendancy it held in the 60s and 70s and possibly the early 80s. And I think that that's partly because, folks have wised up to that it was all about male opportunism.
Okay, that's a lot to work with.
It is.
First of all, I still think that could apply to any kind of music. But you do mention in the book that a lot of this actually does apply to gangster rap as well.
Well, that's right. The inheritor of that rock, that rock anger, that middle class, aspirational, compete, go hard, and if you die trying, then so be it, which was very much the ethos of rock. I spend a lot of time talking about Club 27 and the high mortality, the appallingly high mortality of male rock stars. If WorkCover New South Wales, our health and safety legislators, knew about the high mortality of rock stars, then rock and roll would not be possible because of the paperwork involved, because you're so much more likely to die. And that danger and that sort of male opportunism combined with male anger and just the determination to, climb from absolutely zero to the point where you're like 50 Cent and you're merchandising water, that has been inherited very much by hip-hop. And by particular, the more gangster strands of hip-hop. And so you ask, where are the Mick Jaggers of the 21st century? And you'd have to say, well, look at Kanye West and look at 50 Cent, because those are the guys.
We have a question from Marie Claire.
How are you differentiating between rock and pop?
It's a good question. And I mean, there is a definitional issue here as well that I should own up to. And the fact that music that is considered to be rock and roll tends to be so much more male biased may well be because of a bias in the minds of the people who analyze and reanalyze and write about music, not considering some types of music that women make rock, whereas this exact same music made by men might be categorized as rock. And so, there certainly is, but it might be a huge part of of the pattern I'm talking about, this inherent sexism in the way that we evaluate rock music. But yeah, again, musicians hate genres. They hate being categorized because, of course, they want to make a living and they want to be seen as diverse and varied and just multi-talented. And so their music, they see it from the inside and their music is just their music and they can't stand those kinds of labels. But at the end of the day, we have to sort of say, yes, but we understand certain genres have some properties and others have other properties.
Now, this is obviously the toughest one for me to get behind, but because I'm thinking, again, and it is the point of your book, how much of this is evolution and how much is cultural conditioning? Because especially when we're talking about rock and roll and the gender dynamics and the fact that we see far less rock goddesses, let's say, I mean, there may be less interest from young girls simply because they don't often see women rock stars. It might not occur to them to pursue that.
That's entirely true. You're right. And yet at the same time, for the entire 1960s and 70s, the whole Billboard Hot 100 was dominated by men. With the ascendancy of rock and with most of the stuff on the charts being rock, women were almost invisible in the production of music at that top level. And obviously not invisible. There were plenty of great artists who were women at that time. But at the same time, we have this return to now where 50% of the women in pop and electronica and dance, so 50% of the artists, are women. And so you say, well, how can the culture work one way in one genre that's somewhat arbitrarily defined, but not in this other genre that's somewhat arbitrarily defined? So I'm really sympathetic to the idea that there are all sorts of cultural dynamics involved, and yet even gender itself, I believe, to have a far more interesting evolutionary basis than the simple sort of biological accounts of sex differences. And here's a good example. Going back to what I said about sort of living fast and dying young among rock stars, it is when conditions of economic inequality are greatest, that men strive the most furiously and take the greatest risks, and as a consequence die much sooner than in conditions of relative economic equality. And so, for instance, in the US, homicide rates are much higher than they are in Canada. And Martin Daly and Margot Wilson have done some wonderful analyses, and they show that it's not just because of the differences between the US and Canada in gun laws, even though, that's one dramatic, obvious difference, but there's a huge difference between the US and Canada in economic inequality. In the US, the poorest states are the most inequitable ones, and the wealthiest states tend to be the ones with the greatest equality. And in fact, those wealthiest, more equal states have the lower homicide rates, and the poorest and most inequitable have the highest homicide rates. But in Canada, the order is reversed, because out in the Maritimes, where the average income is lowest, the social security net is stronger, and so the inequality is is more equality. Whereas out west, where there is more wealth, there is also more inequality. And it is the inequality rather than the wealth that defines the homicide rates. And so Canada actually, for inequality, the relationship between inequality and homicide rate, Canada fits very much on the same graph as the US. They're just down at the lower end for both inequality and for homicide rates. Those homicide rates are the kinds of homicide that are basically young men killing young men. And what happens is you go out and there are young men showing off, and they show off to one another, and they bump into one another, or somebody looks at somebody or someone else's girlfriend the wrong way, and there's are you looking at me? Yes, I'm looking at you. What are you going to do about it? That kind of dynamic emerges, and somebody punches somebody else, and somebody falls on, the person who gets punched falls on the pavement and cracks their head and dies, or the fight ends up with somebody dying, or something like that, or somebody drives off in a huff and ends up killing themselves in a car crash. So these accidental, crazy, silly things that young men do are amplified in conditions of inequality, in which you have to strive to become one of the few winners and not be one of the many losers. And as a consequence, as an aggregate outcome, as the economists would say, you have an increase in homicide rate and in death by accident and in poor health outcomes for young men. And that's driven almost entirely by inequality. And rock and roll is the same thing. As the technology is allowed for some men to produce, to be heard in every corner of the world, like Elvis and Paul McCartney and John Lennon, and other musicians to basically starve to death or give up their music, there's this frantic striving and risk-taking, and there's dying by getting into wrong aeroplanes or the wrong car or onto the wrong motorbike or taking drugs a little too much. And so it is. I hope I'm giving the impression here that what we have is an interaction between a complicated biological adaptation that adjusts for our current circumstances and the likely returns, plus the cultural circumstances that we're kind of thrown into at birth.
Now, we are completely out of time, but I'm going to ask you to quickly answer one last question from the website, from Tony.
Why did it take so long in human history for men to figure out that rock and roll could have this effect on women?
I think that men have known for quite some time that music has an effect on women, as women have known that music has an effect on men. We do know that in the 18th century, Italian men used to go around and sing to their intendeds and to people they wanted to court. And that's what the serenade is. The Wadabi tribe in the Sahel, the men would dance and sort of sing to this rhythmic tune for 2 days, solid. And the best man gets to go off and spend a dirty weekend with somebody else's wife. And that's just a culturally agreed to kind of circumstance. And so the relationship between music and sex has ever been strong. I think that the economic circumstances, plus the instruments that were in the ascendancy, plus the innovation of the bluesmen and country singers and stuff, all of those things came together to create rock and roll in the 1950s.
Oh, we're out of time. And Rob, I would love to argue with you about this for another episode. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Desiree, thank you so much for having me.
You can find the link to Rob Brooks and his book, Sex, Genes, and Rock and Roll, on our website at skepticallyspeaking.com. While you're there, click the links to Facebook, Twitter, and Google Plus so that you can be the first to hear about upcoming live episodes. And of course to iTunes, where you can subscribe to our program or check out our past shows. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week on Skeptically Speaking.
Bring it on, the skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is. 'Cause we're skeptically speaking.